I was thinking, oh, will it go bad?
I was expecting that.
Yeah. No,
what I was
looking for the stream to start.
Yeah. Also, what I was expecting was I'd count down, it would connect, and then there'd be this loud bang, and my computer would explode and lose power.
Because half a million people.
The first people are joining. Yes.
Yes. So we go. Yeah. So usually, like I made the mistake for most of last year of joking that everything actually starts at 5 past because I teach for a living and that's how teaching works. Except
has anyone? Because I can't see. Has anyone joined yet? I can't see anything.
Yeah, we've got
12 people and counting. So
cool.
That's good.
Cool. All right, sweet. So now this is the point.
I can just see you two and me.
Yeah. Oh no, it's not interactive. It's not Zoom. It's just us. We are the all-powerful streaming gods at this point.
Oh, I see. All right.
Cool. All right. Cool. So I just realized I forgot to do something, which I'm going to very quickly do, and then we'll launch into it when we get back. Hello, Vlad.
We could do finger puppets. How are you at finger puppets, Jasper? Well, so 2015, 5 years. Okay. So who did you initially, or did you just pull it out yourself?
Initially, I just pulled it out myself, but at some point, I really started training and working with my fellow instructor and now girlfriend, Deandra. And we've been teaching workshops together since 2017 or something. So we've mainly been, at some point we just started diverging from what we already knew from say Watsega or Wagner, and we started to do our own thing, which you can clearly see on my Instagram, of course. That's
yeah. Everyone should check out Jasper's Instagram. Actually, we should probably formally start. We're starting to hit critical mass, or uncritical. I don't know, maybe uncritical mass. But yeah.
Are we putting some PP in critical mass?
Probably. I've got a fencing mask. Yeah. So hello everyone. Welcome to the stream. So yeah, this is part of the Old Sword Club's new kind of initiative for our live streams, where at the end of every month we do something special, and we thought, since everyone had a lot of fun with Pete's talk last year about re-enactment and my talk about Viking weapons, and also a lot of the stuff that Jasper added to that, we'd just do a big talk about Viking Age weapons and warfare. So yeah, just to kind of introduce everyone. So on the left we have Jasper, who is a Dutch archaeologist specialising in the early medieval period, specifically in weapons. He's also done a master's project where he's looked at about 50 early medieval swords, some of which I think we're seeing tonight, and is also a HEMA instructor, specialising in like the reconstruction of Viking Age weapons. So unlike me and Pete, who sort of kind of dabble in it, Jasper does that full time, and I believe is planning on sort of setting up or re-establishing a HEMA club post pandemic.
Yeah. Still kind of in the middle of it, so can't really do much at the moment.
We're all waiting for the vaccine.
Yeah, and one of these days. But yeah, no, but everyone should sort of pay attention to Jasper. Just especially if you want to get into Viking stuff. And then next we've got Pete Radvan. Pete was there at the beginning.
Beginning of everything.
Yeah, it's because you're. I mean, not only were you at the beginning of like HEMA in Australia with the founding of Stoccata, but also the beginning of a lot of the using HEMA as a lens through which to try and explore Viking Age combat. When Paul Wagner and Steve Hand. No, I did get that right. My brain thought that I called them Paul Hand and Steve Wagner, and I'm like, no, but I did actually get it right. Sort of said, hey, well, maybe Telhofer's techniques will work with big round shield, and you've been doing that sort of stuff for however long it's been going on. as well as sort of being an instructor at Stoccata, specialising in silver, and then also just as a fun kind of bit of trivia, Pete's the person who got me into HEMA, like something like 20 years ago now. It's even,
back by Dark Age Society. That would be it would be something like 20 years ago, yeah, when you first started coming along to McDas.
Yeah, first came. Actually, weirdly enough, it was joining MacDas. I did want to do re-enactment, and I was very, very into swords and studying history. But the actual reason, but also it was a political arrangement because I was denied a stall by the SRC, and MacDas had 2 stalls. So I said,
that's
well,
right. Yeah.
Back in the day. But yeah, so but Pete is also an experienced re-enactor. He's been doing that since I think we established before I was born. So yeah, long.
I joined a re-enactment group in 1982. I started hitting people with swords in 1982.
Oh wow, yeah. So very, very experienced.
A long time.
Yeah. Which now means I have to introduce myself, and I'm like, hey, I instruct a bit at the Old Sword Club and did like a history degree and research on my own and complain about stuff on the internet sometimes. But yeah, for those who don't know me, I'm Tim. So I do these most weeks, and then every so often try and drag people in to try and get out of doing it every so often. Anyway, so we're going to start. So the plan for tonight is we're going to start off with each speaker just saying, spending about 20 so-ish minutes, maybe 30, talking about whatever it is they want to talk about in relation to Viking Age weapons and warfare. And then we're going to move into like a Q&A. So if you do have a question, just chuck it straight in the chat, comments, whatever it's called at your end. I can't promise we'll get to it straight away, but if you're halfway through Jasper's presentation, you have a question, we will get to it after the presentation. And I'll also be, sort of showing the questions on the screen as they come up, or as we're answering them, so everyone knows what we're answering. But yeah, so anyway, without further ado, I might pass it over to Jasper to begin presentation, and go from there. So, cool. So your presentation should be on screen now, Jasper.
Yeah. Fair enough. Well, thank you, Tim, for the introduction. As he said, I'm not actually Australian. I'm Dutch. I'm a Dutch archaeologist. Graduated in 2018. My master's, looking at and researching the early medieval swords in the Netherlands, and that master thesis hasn't been published though, because at that time it felt kind of rushed and I wasn't really happy with it. But now, 2.5 years later, I think I have a pretty good idea of what the hell actually happened. Now I've taken more time. And besides being an archaeologist, I'm also a HEMA instructor, trying to start up my own club post-pandemic. And I've been teaching a lot of workshops with my fellow instructor, Deandra, who's also here. And you can see a few pictures on the screen of that. But yeah, looking at my master's thesis and early medieval swords in the Netherlands, practically 2 typologies are pretty standard to use. And when I'm talking about the early medieval periods, for the Dutch periods, I'm talking about the Merovingian, Carolingian, and Ottonian eras, of which Carolingian and Ottonian could be described as Viking Age. So on the top left, you've got an overview of the typology of Mangin from 1983, detailing Merovingian swords, and in this case specifically pommels. And of course, the top left and right pictures are from Gaibi, which I used because as German typologies, they're quite well suited for the Dutch archaeological record. For sword blades from Guybeat, types 1 to 5 are applicable for this time period, with type 1 being early Carolingian and Merovingian, types 2 and 3 Carolingian, and 4 and 5 Ottonian. So yes, with my master thesis, I was really aiming at the functionality of the sword. What were the design? Why was the sword designed in that way? How was it used? And that was quite a difficult answer to ask myself, because there's no real straight answer for it. But in that sense, I used the same theoretical background as, for instance, Wojciecha advocates quite a lot that form follows function. Though I did try to specify it a bit better with long-term experimental archaeology, trying to decipher based on my own HEMA experience how the design of the sword changes how I used it. And for that I drew parallels with my experience from Messer, based on Le Kuchner, and of course 133. There's 3 different weapons, each have to be handled in their own specific way based on the sword design. It was quite challenging. But now onto the good pictures, of course. For my master thesis, I've analyzed 46 early medieval swords and a few saxes as well for a comparison. And you're going to see those pictures here on screen. Most of these swords and saxes are from Dutch archaeological provincial depots and not from musea. I made that choice because I wanted to also highlight and bring to the forefront some of the swords and objects that got stuffed away, that weren't as well preserved, and as archaeological depots, they're a lot more accessible for young researchers such as myself to analyze and hold the swords than a museum would be, because that would take a lot more bureaucracy and a lot more planning to do, and I was really in a hurry to get this thesis done. But because they got their stuff into depots, they're not the best. Most of the time, they're not the best preserved swords. As you can see, there's quite a lot of corrosion. Though this sword, which is an actual, presumably Viking sword, that is in the depot of the city of Maastricht, was found during dredging work in the Meuse River, and it's been linked to several Viking raids in the area. This one, unfortunately, I couldn't hold in my hands myself, because it was very fragile. As you can see, looking at the blade, it's very corroded, but the hilt was perfectly preserved, and I could take a lot of fine measurements from it. And that's basically what I did for all the objects that I held. I took a lot of measurements of the total sword length, the hilts, cross guards, and even if the object allowed it, I would look at the orientation of the pommel, because at that point, when I was working on my master thesis, that I got introduced to the idea of the twisted pommel. But we'll get to that later. But a lot of the swords and saxes such as this are in this condition, because a lot of them originate from graves, specifically Merovingian weapons, and that's just generally means that they've been buried in sand. They're very corroded, and certainly, for instance, with the right one, the right sax, besides taking a total measurement and a general measurements, you can't really say a lot about that. So that's quite a problem with a lot of this material, and also with the left sword, which is, by the way, from the same grave as the Sax. A lot of the preservation that how do you say that? Preservation efforts of these swords aimed at restoring them to full instead of showing what actually was preserved archaeologically. So a lot of this on the left sword is actually plastic or epoxy. That is an archaeological presence. This preservation effort has not been popular for quite some years now, luckily. Instead now they're focusing a lot more on what was actually there instead of trying to fill it in. So a lot of the younger or more recently found blades are a lot more reliable in that sense. And of course there's the problem of, certainly with the swords found in graves, that there's a lot of sheaths still attached to it, so you can't really take accurate measurements of the blade itself. On the left is, by the way, something that I found really interesting. It's just a bit of a side note. An early winged spear from Maastricht as well. But I just found it beautiful to look at, so I thought I'd include it. And of course, not every sword you find is complete. These are two examples. The left one also being a Viking sword from Dorstad, the big trading city in the middle of the Netherlands, which got raided at least 3 to 5 times by Vikings in consecutive years. This sword was, the left one was quite influential because it was one of the first swords in which I could look at the alignment of the pommel, because it was very obvious that it hadn't been it had been conserved rather than restored. So it was really quite a reliable sword to look at, even though a lot of the blade was still missing. Same with this one, though it of course has preserved a little bit. It has a worse preservation. But then this is actually the one of the best swords, and also the strangest sword that I've come across. It is in the Museum de Valkhof in Nijmegen. And if you look at the left picture, it has a really beautiful Damascene pattern inlaid on the sword, which does make it a bit later. But what intrigued me as well was the hilt design. It has the longest hilt of any of the swords that I found, and also with just being 2 discs, I couldn't really fit it into any of the existing typologies that I've come across. It certainly wasn't in either Mengen or Geibig nor Oakshott. So I think I compromised by calling it a Peterson type M, but I know that's completely wrong. And it actually has a pommel which orients clockwise, indicating that it's meant for a left-handed person. But yeah, a lot of these swords are really worth looking at. But yeah, here are some of the averages that I came across measuring them. All the measurements there are in millimeters, and I've differentiated them based on the blade typology, because that's a lot more uniform than either of the hilt designs or any of the possible hilt designs. But what you can see is that at least the Type 1 blades are very uniform and don't actually change a lot, and even only with the Type 5 swords, which is a really long one. See if I can find a good Type 5. Yeah, this is, for instance, the Type 5 blade. Those are getting really long, and have been always interpreted as being the first cavalry swords, though I still doubt that quite a lot, because also based on my measurements, I can't really see any kind of differentiation based on any or specialization of these swords. Looking at early medieval warfare, which I think we'll discuss later on as well, I'd say that there's no real cavalry swords now, or specifically infantry swords that could be used on either side. I'm really rambling with my words here. Now, what I've found is that, as I said, well, these swords aren't really optimized for any specialized use, but they are quite, they of course are quite choppy. The design choices that led to these swords indicate for me that, of course, these swords are highly, are very special weapons, only reserved for the few, because, of course, they're only found very rarely, and they're meant for the elite, and also to reinforce those elite persons that swing around these swords. They're very these swords are meant for chopping and one big thrust, but not necessarily slicing or being very precise. You because of the balance of these swords, you really have, you get to make really big movements, almost showing them off. That combined with the decoration of the swords, when you're swinging around these swords on the battlefield, you really stand out, and that's what these swords are meant for: standing out, reinforcing the idea that you're that you are the biggest, baddest, strongest person around there, and that also helps with advancing yourself politically on the battlefield. As I said, with all the 46 Sparta that I looked at, on 7 of them I could positively identify that they had a misaligned pommel. That doesn't mean that you have to take that with a bit of quite a grain of salt, because of these of all the 46 swords, only 12 were complete, as in they had a complete blade, complete and a pommel and crossguard present. But the other 5 were very old finds, and so I couldn't really accurately say that they hadn't been tampered with by a previous conservator. These 7 swords were actually, just the way they were, only preserved. So these swords had misaligned pommels. 5 of them were twisted counterclockwise, indicating that they were used for a right-handed person, and 2 were twisted clockwise, indicating being used by a left-hander. And why this misaligned pommel is of importance, you can see in the picture above. There I'm holding a a black fencer Viking sword, though the owner twisted the pommel slightly on my request. The owner of Black Fencer twisted the pommel on my request to make it more accurate with some of the swords that I found. And you can see, holding that sword with my right hand, that I can align the blade quite well. But if I switch it to my left hand, that the alignment gets thrown off immensely, and actually trying to hold it up, which with good edge alignment feels very uncomfortable. On the cross guards, you do tend to see that as the periods or the early medieval period progresses, that they do get longer, indicating, of course, that there's a greater need for more hand protection, because this isn't limited by the length of the crossguard isn't at all limited by, for instance, the technology of the early medieval swordsmith. At some point, there's just a greater need for it, possibly linked to changes in shield design. For instance, the appearance of the huge Norman kite shields, the big teardrop shields. Those have to be held closer to the body, exposing the sword hand more regularly, and therefore, of course, putting your hand at a greater risk, and therefore needing more needs for hand protection. So to actually completely analyze the sword and understand what choices led to the creation of those swords the way they were, you have to actually look at the entire spectrum of early medieval weaponry, and also take into account, say, the political or social landscape of the time period. And that's also, of course, also true for Viking Age Scandinavia. So knowing that, we tend to think of these Vikings as, pretty strong men, is, it might be true, but there's a lot of, they aren't just brutally killing each other, they're also trying to, prove a point to each other and to the enemies, with these big slashing swords that they're forced to be reckoned with, and being a force to be reckoned with gives you political power back in your home region. But just to close off, some things that have happened. Looking here is part of a sword blade that I've personally excavated in the winter of 2019 with my work as an archaeologist. This sword blade was found in Weert in the southern Netherlands at the bottom of a well. And as you can see on the X-ray, it is Damascened, and the well itself is probably Carolingian. And initially I thought this would be a type 4 or 5 blade, but now I'm more inclined to saying, of course, it's Carolingian, because when restoring it, they also found the tip of the sword, leading to a better identification of the sword blade, because a sword blade on its own without any points to it can make it quite difficult to analyze it. It's about 40 centimeters of sword blade that have been preserved, and it was already like this when it was thrown into the well. It's not like when excavating it we missed the rest of the sword. No, this was just it. leading to the idea that this sword was, of course, speaking as a true archaeologist, ritually murdered and ritually depositions or thrown into the well, possibly as a way of putting both the sword and the well to rest, discontinuing both their uses. The sword was also bent. The sword blade was also bent, and when I finally get to truly analyze the sword blade, I'm also going to see if the fragments, or if the sword broke because of the bending, or it was both bent and broken. So I'm really interested to see what happened there. And in a few months back, we also got news in the Netherlands that a new sword was found. This one isn't Viking, maybe unfortunately, but it is very spectacular. That in the middle of the Netherlands, a complete medieval sword was excavated at the bottom of a well, not on a well, of a lake. And this is a very special sword because looking at, for instance, the typology of Gaiby, there's no disc pommels that he mentions, though Oakshott mentions that disc pommels already start to originate on his Type 10 blades. But thus far, this is the first disc pommel sword in the Netherlands that can be positively dated through carbon dating just after 1100. I always kind of assumed that disc pommels would only start to originate later in the at the beginning of the 13th century, but now this sword makes it a very special sword, and also an advocate for certainly Dutch archaeologists, but I'd also like to encourage archaeologists throughout Europe or wherever, that whenever you come across a closed context such as a lake, or in my case a well that you completely excavated, because there is a very small chance that that you actually find a sword blade there, or a sword, which can help a lot with trying to date the sword, because a lot of the swords found in Europe originate from rivers, which makes dating them very, very difficult, because of course it's not properly excavated. It's just being dredged up, and all dating contexts with that sword, or helping to any context helping dating that can help dating that sword, are destroyed by the dredging works. And here you've got with the case of this sword and the previous sword also, we can actually really help redefine typologies by having an accurate date on when that sword was around. So, but with that said, that was my short presentation. I know it was a bit rambly, but possibly during the later talks, I'll also, might bring up a few more things I missed during the small presentation. And I'd like to take it over to you, Tim.
Thank you. That was I really enjoyed that. So thank you for that. So I think we did have some direct questions for you.
Yes, I see.
Yeah. Also, what I'm going to do is just go through and flash them up on the screen as we go. So
I've also got the questions.
Someone's got a comment just on when the Merovingian, Carolingian, and Ottonian period was, which.
I'm sorry for that. I didn't really specify like that. The Merovingian period in the Netherlands lasts from 481 to 751 AD. The Carolingian period stretches from 751 to 987 AD, and the Ottonian period roughly lasts from 900 to 1000 AD. And the names of these periods are derived from the Frankian dynasties in power at that point. We don't really have for the English, we don't really have an Anglo-Saxon time period or Viking time period or Vendel time period, because the Netherlands is, covered with the written word at that point, so we know which kings or dynasties were in place, so we tend to adjust our dating to that. And also, the Dutch weren't raided as regularly as, for instance, the English. A lot of the raids, Viking raids that happened in the Netherlands tend to be politically motivated instead of just plain old piracy. Sorry. And we've also had a few Danish warlords installed here by the Frankish kings to stop Viking invasions, and they tended to be very good at that. Fortunately or unfortunately, however you look at it, the Netherlands didn't become a second Normandy, because during the Ottonian period, those Danish warlords were cast out due to political struggles. But it's a time period which hasn't been really, which actually hasn't really been covered by even Dutch history classes. That at some point Danes ruled over the Netherlands, and also the Netherlands tend to be on the periphery of the Frankish economical centers. So there aren't a lot of big city centers or centers to pillage. So for piracy, it's not the best place to look at. I'd rather go to England if I was a Viking.
That's sort of like, a takeaway from anyone if you're considering being a Viking, go to England. That was really cool. One thing I found really interesting with, we were talking about how during the Ottonian period, a lot of the Danes were cast out. Many years ago, I was doing a lecture series on the Viking Age, and one of the things I actually found with that was that a lot of European nations, as part of their national mythology, have the casting out of the Vikings, or resisting the Vikings. So obviously the English with Alfred the Great, which is the king from the Last Kingdom. If you watch that series. Also in Ireland, you have Brian Boru, who's his thing that supposedly united all of Ireland into Ireland was casting out the Vikings, although he did a lot of warring with everyone else who was in Ireland at the time, and also in Russia with the Varangian Rus, and that. So it's kind of interesting that the Netherlands have the same kind of thing, where it's there's at this point where the Danes are cast out, and but
it's not really as easily, put together as, for instance, the Irish or the English, because for the Netherlands, the Netherlands weren't really a thing in the early medieval period. We had right up until 750, you had Magna Frisia, the Frisians living around the coast, and at the start of the Carolingian period, they were conquered by the Carolingians. Charles Martel and Charlemagne later on, but the Vikings were actually cast, or the Danes, I should say, were actually cast out at the moment that the Lotharingian kingdom became divided between West and East Francia. So there's a lot more power play going on than just the Netherlands. The Netherlands weren't a thing, therefore it's not really part of our national identity. We're, in recent years, a lot more focus has been placed on the Frisian struggle against the Franks, rather than us actually being conquered and whatever happened when the Franks were in charge. So that makes it the early medieval Netherlands in a political or historical political sense are a minefield, trying to make sense of it.
Yeah, no, and I guess also like there's a big element of sort of what narratives actually resonate with people sort of going forward. So we've got a next question, which was from Nick, who wanted to know why are the pommels and guards in such good condition.
Yeah, I see that. Why they are in that good of a condition, it's really difficult to tell sometimes because I've also had a lot of just sword blades, not pommel and guard. But I think the most, and I'm not really sure if this is true, but there's a lot more metal there. And, you know, a sword blade is very thin, 5 millimeters at most. So that's very easily corroded. Whereas, for instance, the pommels and crossguards are easily 16, 17, 20 plus millimeters thick, so there's a lot more metal there. But one thing that you can also take a note that at some point the metal, certainly the pommel can get loose and then your entire sword falls apart, your entire grip falls apart. And I think that's also something that you should keep in mind, that sometimes they just disappear, or I've also known of cases where the pommel was intentionally removed from the sword, therefore killing it before being depositioned. Because as soon as the pommel gets taken off, you have nothing holding your sword together. So you behead the sword by removing the pommel. And that's how they are sometimes found in graves. So yeah, as to why they are, my guess, there's just more metal. But yeah, let's see.
Cool. So yeah, so another question. I think you did cover this a bit in your talk, but there was a bit of discussion about why. There's actually quite a discussion in the chat about why there is a misalignment. Because I think, well, one thing that struck out to me, not to put words in anyone's mouth, but it seemed kind of interesting that they'd be misaligned at all. Like I would have assumed that, at the very least, what people would want is a good sort of sword that is symmetrical way down. Yeah.
I don't think it has anything to do with post-depositional processes or what happens with the sword when it decays in the ground, or whatever happens to it. It might be a bit of construction that the swordsmiths actually made it that way, but it also might be that due to wear and tear, it becomes like that. So, though I do know that. For instance, Warchecha, whenever he posts about swords, that he sees that some pommels are intentionally shaped that way that the hole for the tang is, not perfectly aligned with the rest. So there are some hints to say that misaligning the pommel is a deliberate choice by the swordsmith for the owner of that sword. So yeah, that does also hint that also due to the enormous variety of pommel shapes or grip shapes, combined with the intentional misalignment of pommels, that there's a good hint that at least the grips are made locally by local swordsmiths for the new owner, but blades can be more mass-produced. So there's a lot of personal choice involved in the grip. So it's really made for the owner.
Okay. So it's kind of like, because I mean, you see a lot of that in much later periods where blades are made in essentially sort of medieval industrial centres, where they're hilted. Okay, and well, I guess the thing that I don't know if you looked for this, but things I wonder is the tang actually twisted as well, or is it just the pommel?
No, I don't know. I haven't. With one of the swords from Dorstad that I showed, it does seem a bit like the tang is also twisted, but that is possibly due to how the sword was found, with big dredger. Therefore bending the sword. But from what I know, the tang is straight. The tang isn't twisted. So it most likely is that the pommel itself is made is made to misalign, not that the entire tang is. Which would also then, of course, fit the made to order.
Yeah, so the deliberate, there's a bit of deliberate misalignment of the
so that the sword actually extends, in the line of the arm when fully extended. So it's not a hammer grip, but it's meant to at some point at least end up in this kind of grip. I'm really tempted to grab a sword now.
Definitely get a sword. That's half the fun of this, is getting to show off all the swords.
So I think I think this grip was kept in mind when detailing the misalignment of the pommel, which of course led to my conclusion that they're really choppy blades. They're also very heavy. They could make thinner blades and thinner points. You see that on spears all the time. But they really chose to have a very heavy chopping blade. And holding it like this is the easiest and certainly the easiest way of delivering a good straight chop.
Cool. So so sort of like there's a bit of an indication of like the technique used. Rather than just maybe just like an aesthetic preference. All right, cool. So I've got one question which I think is a bit broader than just what you were talking about, but the question from Bob about making a Viking shield, which I thought Pete might also want to give some thoughts on in kind of leading to him talking.
Okay, this is a really. I can't see the entire question, but.
Do you want me to read it out?
Yeah, no, I do also make my own shields, shaping planks. What he's building at the moment is a Viking shield with a smaller board attached to the bigger one for the center weight effect. I see. Is a circular grip most authentic? Yes, though I do advise planing your grip a bit, so that you have some bevels that you can feel, and helping you maintain your grip on the shield. How center weighted should the shield be? Detailing like the Society for Combat Archaeology's most recent. No problem. Yeah. I think it's best to look at the new article, published by the Society for Combat Archaeology on Viking Age shields. Though I do really advise on just hand planing the shield to its correct thickness, with 2 millimeters at the edge, then quite sharply thickening to 4 millimeters, a few centimeters from the edge. And then gradually going to around 6 millimeters at the center. So I think if you're being able to center weight your shield, it will make it a lot more comfortable to hold than if your shield is an even thickness. And I don't know what the rest of the question is. Could you maybe...
I'll read it out. So, is a circular grip most authentic? How center weighted should a shield be? And what if your boss is too heavy? So,
one thing I do remember or comes to mind, one important detail about authentic shields, and what I've also found with my experimentation is that it's crucial to have the shield handle being a bit sunk into your shield board, so it extends into your shield, instead of that it pokes out. If you get what I mean. Having the handle in the shield board does make it a lot easier to carry and control. As for a heavy shield boss, I'm not really sure how that would affect the handling, but that's mainly due to me not having experimented with that. So I can't really answer that part of your question.
yeah, I guess coming back to sort of the combat archaeology aspect of this, I always found that having a flatter shield, like having a flatter handle, made for better control of the shield. So having a round handle meant the shield would very easily turn in my hand, whereas having a flatter handle, more like rectangular, like a sword grip, I had finer control. Whether or not that bears out in the archaeology, I don't know. So I'm not an archaeologist. I don't know. So I think from here we're going to move on, and it's
another
Pete's turn.
question from Bob. Why did the swords often have such small, short hilts? Anything to do with handling it with the shield? Well, that question. It depends on whether you mean with the hilts, if you mean the grip itself or the crossguard. The thing I'm holding here is a reconstruction by Incarius Craft on a 10th century sword, which has a 10 centimeter grip, which for me is a perfect size, as it is. So, and you also saw that with my averages, that those averages range between 9 and 10 centimeters. And with that beautifully ornamented Viking sword that I showed at the beginning, that one had the shortest grip of all, being only 8 centimeters, or just below 8 centimeters. Which for me indicates that at least no padded glove was intended to be used as some form of hand protection. This is just it. Maybe a leather glove, but a small leather glove, but no more than this. In terms of the smaller crossguard, if you're trying to use a big crossguard on a sword like this with a actively used center grip shield, it will get in the way. So I think that's really one of the choices there. From this crossguard saves you in the pinch, but it shouldn't be on its own. So I think it has a lot to do with being used with the shield. But for instance, what I've got here is a more of a standard re-enactment sword. Maybe it's a bit on the more cheaper end, but it has a very, very long grip, as you can see. And its pommel is actually, squarish or rectangular, making that a handshake grip just isn't comfortable. That's one of the details that I really started to appreciate, is that a lot of the, or practically all early medieval pommels are boat-shaped, or a long oval at least. And the one pommel that I did have that was rectangular was very thin to compensate for its shape. So that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, this grip was definitely designed with a big glove in mind. But Irish mod of I really prefer just a small short grip. So,
I'm just putting up the mention. There's a mention of your Instagram, which I've been really enjoying going through.
No, that's my fellow instructor and girlfriend watching it, joining in. So
I thought that was worth putting up. Anyway, we might move on now and give Pete a chance to talk. So, Pete, take it away, Pete. I'm not very good at these transitions, so Pete's just going to have to start talking. So.
All right. Am I coming through? Yes, no?
Yes, we hear you.
You hear me? Good. Okay. Yes. I had it on the floor to make sure it wasn't causing interference, the laggy connection. So the lips and the words are not touching each other. Look, as far as the stuff on the handle goes, yes, I've got a recreation of the which survived with the silver rings as part of the decoration, which gives you a fairly good idea of the length of it's just enough for the hand, and say a glove. And if you do what you should do when you've got a large round shield, which is not go in front of your shield, then you don't need to protect your hand. And if your hand wanders out in front of the shield, then hand. And you better learn how to fight left-handed if you keep sticking your right hand in front of your shield. But Jasper's the one doing all I do is try to see how those things work by actually using them. Just remarkable stuff on the big shield stuff, way more sophisticated than anything I do. The stuff I do is but it's good to see, because are all of those techniques necessarily going to be useful? Well, it's no one person is going to learn to use all of those. You get too many tricks in your book and you're going to get tied up. But what happens is some of those things work for them. I keep it all very simple, because as I get older and older, there's less and less I can do. So let me do. But as far as what I've been doing, for those of you who don't know, enactment combat in 1982. Now, in 1982, what we were doing with swords bears relationship to anything we now do in HEMA. There's no reference to any documentation. It really was literally make it up as you go along, and it was show fighting, basically a pretty show for an audience, with minimal martial intent. It was still good fun. It was. I started along with Steve Hand and Anne started helped start Stoccata in 1998. Was when Stoccata School of Defence started, but the work on interpretation shield stuff was done by Steve Hand and Paul Wagner in the early 2000s, and that was seen by Roland Vorchesa, who went, "Ooh, look at this good stuff," and he grabbed it and he went off, and marvelous. His biomechanical stuff is just absolutely fantastic. And if you want to see the very best of true time, Silver's 2 times, with the 2 gladiators demonstrating true times, and nothing, I've never seen an explanation of true times that is as clear and easy to understand as that stuff that Roland did. But as far as my interest, it was in Viking spear and shield, mainly because I had a kind of little moment back in the McDass days, back in the 2003, and I thought to myself, well, can't the 130 thing and underbinding with spear and shield? And the answer is it can. It can work perfectly nicely. So I started going, okay, well, if someone can overbind my sword, then someone can overbind my spear, and you can overbind the spear very nicely. But acting spear and shield, because it's really very simple. In order to get your spear overbound, it's got to be sticking out in front of your shield. That sticks their spear in front of their shield. You overbind it with your step in, do a shield knock, and do something nasty to them if you can. The way you avoid that is you don't stick your spear in front of your shield and stab them. So it makes spear and shield relatively simple in terms of the techniques you're using, but because the spear is a variable length dagger, very, very dangerous. Spear and shield is very, very dangerous. Very, very quick, reaches out long distances, way outreaches a sword, and can be shortened to dagger length. Vigorous, a lot of crashing, and it's safer to crash with spear and shield than it is with a spear and a sword. You stay too long in those close distances with your windings, somebody's going to do something evil with their sword. Their sword free. So with spear, you unless you like bad things happening to you. As far as the sword and shield stuff goes, before I keep mine very simple. The winding stuff, I find if you stay too close on a short, my favorite one is just to cut for the legs. I'm always looking for an opportunity when coming together with those shield binds. It's keep my shield up, opponent's sword is up, and have my sword low, and see if I can cut them on the calf or the back of the knee. Well, I don't tend to wait around to see if someone can wind around my shield, but because my joints don't do what I used to be able to do with them, so I have to keep all my stuff very simple. You young guys can do all kinds of fancy, and do it now. Look, do that kind of stuff while you can, because there will come a time where we don't anymore. So you got to make it simpler as you get older, and the bouncing in and out is as I used to. I can't grasshopper. So what about you, Tim?
So me, well, I guess for me, what I want to talk about is maybe a bit more of a personal story about like how I came to the conclusions I did, because there was a point where I agreed very much with Pete, particularly when I was learning Viking stuff from you initially, and hadn't necessarily done a lot of my own sort of interpretation work and my own sort of personal self-teaching, and then there was a point where I went out and did a bunch of other things and stopped agreeing so much, particularly with your point about spears. I used to think, spear, the whole point of like spear and shield was you kept the other person at the end of your spear. A bunch of submission wrestling, and started to feel well, if the spear can be shortened. I'll actually grab a spear so I can kind of demonstrate this. If the spear can be shortened like this, and used as an ad hoc dagger, then it actually has a huge advantage in close as well as far away. And what I found once I started wrestling is it was very, very easy for me to feel where my opponent was, even through the shield, and even where they're weak, and to kind of be like, oh, well, they're here, so I can push here and stab them. And one thing that I realized with this is the way in which a lot of the approaches that I've been taking and that people have traditionally taken have been very much dictated by, what modern martial arts we have access to and what modern ideas we have access to. So obviously, a all the Viking Age stuff started with reinterpreted Telhofer and people doing like later medieval martial arts, and then sort of trying to apply them, and also to people coming from a modern perspective as, you know, late 20th century, early 21st century martial artists, which is not necessarily an approach that, or is very likely actually an approach and a mindset that is very, very different to people living 1,000 years before in speaking a different language, had a very, very different culture. And I did try and start looking into areas of particularly like, you know, early medieval Scandinavian culture that have impacted this, but then very quickly ran up against the barriers that lack of sources kind of indicate. But something I realized was, well, the way we talk about fighting, the way we think about it in terms, and the other things that we have access to really, really sort of color our interpretation. And so what we end up with is a situation where we have this massive amount of information. We have this like huge amount of potential stuff, which led me to the conclusion that, well, maybe what we should be doing, rather than trying to start an assumption that we know almost nothing, and then get bigger and bigger and bigger until we hit the critical mass where we have an equivalent knowledge. What we should instead be doing is going through a process of expanding and contracting what we think is useful, because there's every chance that we've come up with something that would have been completely foreign to a person in the past. And so what my thing with Viking Age warfare, when we look into it, is trying to find easy ways to defeat whatever is being done, as a way of eliminating things that maybe are not historical, or finding a way to work out what probably wasn't done, and then of everything left over, we can then say, okay, well, we know all of this is practical, maybe not historical, but certainly practical. And a core example of that kind of thing is the sort of mistake that I see a lot of beginners make, and the sort of thing that very, very quickly a lot of the modern interpretations realize wrong, which is holding the shield out flat on. And if you give a bunch of new people a shield, the first thing they'll do is grab it and they'll hold out with the flat. Then they'll get to here and realize that this is really difficult and uncomfortable. Like, the shield basically blocks my hand. So the solution is to hold it out, and which also has the added advantage of making it as big as possible. And this lasts as a good idea right up until the point where someone puts it on the flat and turns it in the hand. And this is why nearly all interpretation, well, not all, but most interpretations of Viking Age shield use, or the use of these big round shields, is edge on. Because they was realized very, very quickly that biomechanically, to strike the edge here is not going to displace it, or is not going to displace it very much. And to strike the flat here is going to leave your weapon somewhere out here in the, well away from the other person, and you very, very vulnerable to counterattack. And so that's a very simple process of elimination. We go, okay, we know that they probably weren't holding their shields out flat like this. Double show, because these things are quite heavy and your arms will get quite tired. And then the question that I would ask is, what is the simplest way to win a fight, or like to win both defensively and offensively? And when you with a sword, with single weapons, I find the answer is usually the simplest way to win offensively is to snipe the weapon arm of your opponent. And the simplest way to win defensively is to countercut this to single-time defend. So I just stick my sword on the center line, just place my opponent's blade and hit them. And then from there, and this is something you see in 19th century fencing, which is a lot better documented. Everything else starts to develop where all of the timing and the opposition attack is basically there to avoid being easily countercut, and the guards, the way the guards are held, the way you engage, is designed to basically make sure that your opponent doesn't easily just crack you on the hand. With the shield, as Justin was talking about, if you hold it properly, provides a lot of tacit hand protection. So no one's sniping at hands. And I found the easiest way to win with against someone who didn't know what they're doing with a sword and shield. If I have a sword and shield, is to come in high and go low and undercut. So the next step with that is that you go, okay, well, if that's the easiest way to win, that's the easiest way to win aggressively as well. People were probably built their systems of fencing around going, right, well, what stops me from being undercut? Which is where I started to get a sense of the different roles of the weapon. So in sword and shield, if I've got, if I want to protect my leg, I move my leg. I don't want to necessarily be dropping or moving my shield. If I want to protect my head, I use my sword, and this, and as the medieval sorts, it's a bit hard to see, but this is where pressing up against the flat of the shield becomes really, really useful, because I also don't want to be doing this and blinding myself or becoming vulnerable to undercut. And the next thing I can do is, all right, what sort of footwork can I use to minimize that same threat? And if I start moving in a circle, if I start circling my opponent, it means the likelihood of an attack coming in on a certain side is drastically reduced. And so that's kind of where I came to the conclusion, okay, well, there's probably just, when people are defending in the Viking Age, they're using the shield for mostly for defenses at like chest height, the sword to cover their heads, because this is not a very useful thing to do, and they're relying very strongly on distance to defend their legs, which was kind of my okay. And then the next step would be to go, right, if that's what we're sort of doing, if that's what we end up doing as a way of defeating the most simple ways of winning, what do we then, what then defeats that? And I think that's where you start to build up a more complex system. Because one of the other things I kind of realized, as much as I'm a really big fan of simplicity and particularly with re-enactment, where you don't want to get people in fighting as quickly as possible, and so you want to teach them very, very simple systems. The further back we go with HEMA, the more complicated systems become, the less succinct. There is this big degree of complexity, although there is another reason for that, not just because there's this huge body of technique that people need to know. The other thing that's, I think, really, really important to the study of historical martial arts is the question of the way people viewed the world. Basically, through different periods, people have viewed the world in distinctly different ways. So, in the Middle Ages, there was a big emphasis on seeking likeness, on looking for things that were similar to other things. It was thought that flowers that looked kind of like an eye could produce a medicine for eyes because there was a similarity and a link there. And the thought when they realized maybe a flower didn't look like an eye, was good for eyes, that might be because there's a hidden similarity. There's a similarity that they haven't seen. And then, as we move into, as we move into sort of the classical period, we get people going, actually, wait, maybe that's wrong. And we start moving to sort of more modern systems of classification where everything is very, very rigidly defined. And now, as we move into modernity, we're actually starting to say, well, maybe things aren't as rigidly defined; they're much more contextually defined. But the problem we have when we get to the Viking Age is we know that for particularly Scandinavian peoples and probably most Northern European peoples, the point where that medieval mentality came in would have been at the tail end of what they were doing. So we don't really know how they viewed the world or how they classified things or how they understood things, which raises the question of, well, how did they classify and understand their martial arts? How did they actually sit down and go, all right, how did they systematize fighting? Because you can see it with see a marked difference between the way Hutton basically go through, and half the time when he's just writing about a technique, he's just describing what it is. He doesn't actually tell you how to do it. Versus something like Fiore, where Fiore is about just reminding the reader what steps to take to mimic him, to mimic the way he fights. Because for a medieval teacher, the way you taught is by getting your students to copy you, whereas for a post-enlightenment, for a 19th century teacher, the way you get the way you teach is by imparting information, imparting factual factual definitions to your students. And unfortunately, I don't really have any answers for this. I don't know if it's a question that can be answered because we don't have a lot. We don't have a lot of sources from Northern European peoples, or pre-Christian Northern people, pre-Christian Northern European peoples. But I think it is something very, very interesting to consider, the way in which the martial arts that they're doing, the way they're structuring, the way they fight, is a reflection of their society. So yeah, that's the main comment I wanted to make. I think we're going to move into Q&A now. So if you do have any questions, by all means ask them. And if not, we're just going to talk amongst ourselves about this stuff, because I mostly just want an excuse to geek out about Viking Age warfare for a bit. So we do have a question from Chris, where he says, I imagine the huge length of spear sticking behind your hand, messing with the balance and power, when you wield it like a dagger. Short answer to that is, yeah, look, doing this, not as nice or as easy to wield as a knife. I'm not going to go fossil for any of my knives here, but it's not as nice or as agile. But it's workable.
Very, very good.
Yeah.
You get anything from stuff that's like only 6 feet long, so probably a maximum of 3-4 meters perhaps for a one hand. So if you've got a long spear, no, you're not going to be doing this. It is important to point out the difference between fighting in battle and single combat. Fighting in battle, all the stuff, whether it's shield winding or stepping around, you're not going to get. You stay in line and smash it, and it's don't let anyone break through and adrenaline and smash in front of you. And there's not a lot of science involved. It's when either a battle, when one side has destroyed that you're going to get individual combat, or for a and in that situation, then the techniques with this, that's when skill really counts. For group combat, large battle, you want a slightly longer spear. If you're short, then people and you're going to outreach, and you don't have a lot of opportunity to change what you would like to, because you're stuck in a line. In skirmish or single combat, I want a short line. I just need to be someone with a sword. With that, you can really you can hold the step towards the butt end to make it longer. You can bring it up towards the dagger, but towards the head end to make it like a dagger. And then the length of the spear shaft behind you is not an issue. But if you've got a 3.5 meter spear with a fairly heavy shaft, then no, you're not going to be holding it like a dagger. It's going to have this great long behind you. It's going to hit your mate behind you in the face. So it's going to work. So yeah, if you've got a long spear, you're not going to be doing that. If you've got a short spear, yeah, you can do much more fancy stuff.
Well, something to also consider with spears. We have. I know of one surviving spear that Tim already posted in the chat from Gletscher in Norway, which survived. but yeah, on spear lengths there is not a lot of stuff known. But what we do have also from indication from graves, which you should also take with a grain of salt, because you don't know if the spear was shortened before it was put in the grave. But what we do know is that at least they seem to all have been one-handed spears, or about one-handed spear length. And yes, there are. I know there are depictions of longer spears of about 240 meters. But I also take those with a grain of salt, because as an archaeologist, certainly in early historical time periods, I tend to be quite distrustful of them, because you're not sure what. There's a lot of different agendas at work there depicting it. Same with, for instance, our interpretation of early medieval battle. As you pointed out, the context and how you're using it is different. I assume or presume at this point that when you're talking about battle, that you're used to fighting in a shield wall, for instance, and that or the traditional shield wall, and that technique, the fancy techniques don't really apply anymore. But I tend to question the entire existence of the traditional shield wall as a whole. I know they've been mentioned in historical texts, but not. But I am of the understanding or theory that a shield wall shouldn't be taken as literal as a wall of shields, but rather as an indication of a group of people just standing together on a battlefield, just as an indication that there's a group of people there. Certainly in the earlier point of Viking Age warfare, with the small scale raids, and not a lot of political unity in the period, I also have my doubts about how well organized such big groups of men or people would be to form a traditional shield wall, because you do need some coordination and some training as a group to do that. But from what we know also from the sagas, as an indication of taking the sagas as literal evidence, but it's society and also the warfare is very much focused on the individual. You as an individual want to stand out. You can't really stand out if you're amongst a group of people. So I do think that during raids, certainly during raids, but also during a few smaller skirmishes or bigger battles that are fought, that people try to get into one-on-ones and try to distinguish themselves with either sword or spear or axe, and they're really trying to show off their skill whilst also trying to defeat their opponent in a spectacular way as they can achieve without losing their life. And in that sense, because you're on your own, I don't think you can really use a really longer two-handed spear, because you can really put yourself in a disadvantage doing that. I am of the opinion that, of course, in the later end of the Viking era, when statehood becomes more of a thing and organization tends to increase, that yes, you get to see those formations in one way or another, whether it be boar snout or shield wall. But certainly for the early medieval periods, or for the earlier period of the Viking Age, that there's a lot more focus on what the individual can do. So I don't know what your take on that is, but
actually, that was something I was going to bring up, and I do want to apologize. There's been a few questions. We will get to your questions.
I see that.
I kind of have a thing on it. One thing you see, like what as Jasper was saying, one thing you see in the sagas a lot is they talk a lot about individual combat, and that seems to be their frame of reference for warrior prowess. I think it's even there's one of the sagas. I think it's Bjorn Saga. It's been a while since I've read them, where he's in what is now Russia, like as mercenary, and he fights. He's part of this big epic battle, but the only thing they actually talk about in the battle is a challenge that he fights against a champion from the other side as a way of ultimately resolving it. And the actual specifics of the battle are barely touched on. And similarly, in Cormac's saga, there's a point where the character of Cormac just goes off raiding for an amount of time. And you'd think, from like a narrative perspective, this would be really interesting. There's battles and he's stealing stuff and whatever. And it just is, he went off raiding. A couple of years later, he came back really wealthy. That's what, like they're not like what should be something that's maybe quite relevant, or you think would be quite relevant and also quite exciting from the perspective of a story, which is all these raids, gets really glossed over in favor of his interpersonal battles, like his one-on-one fights. I think there are obviously descriptions of like skirmishes and group fights in the Icelandic sagas, but the way that certainly the people and the culture that produce them thinks about combat is it's a very much a one-on-one affair, or it's a very personal kind of affair. And I think that's also very important when we're reconstructing how we think these people fought, because if someone's going to go off and learn how to fight, or if someone's learning how to fight in their community, the thing they're actually mostly going to be focusing on is one-on-one combat, because that's what they think about when they think about combat. And so that meant that whatever formation fighting they are doing, whatever group combat they are doing, is probably very, very simple. It's probably learnt very quickly. You probably get like at best like a very quick crash course from an experienced warrior. But most of it, like even if individual combat skills are not super useful in a battlefield environment, which is something that re-enactment and LARP and Boo Herd have all shown again and again and again. They're still what people would be learning, because that's what they think, as far as they're concerned, that's what fighting is. And yes, like that. I guess that goes back to what I was saying context before. So it looks like he doesn't have any further comments on that.
But I think that's a really interesting point you brought up, and I'll try to answer that question. Also
Yeah,
is
that better?
Early medieval society. No, I think fighting in the early medieval period was mainly there's not a lot of formal training in that sense going on as we think of it, say, for in the Roman era, or later periods where you just have a dedicated teacher or drilling. Or I think in the early medieval period, fighting and learning how to fight was a lot more decentralized, more on the community level. And in between your regular day activities, when you can also see that when boys try to play fight with their dad, something like that. There may be a bit of an extreme, analogy, but just play fighting with each other and eventually showing some real sword in there can lead to some really interesting techniques and learning how to fight. But learning how to fight was at least always supervised. Because one of the things that I came across in during my master's thesis and reading about early medieval warfare was an anecdote about the son of Charles, French general Charles who died during a hunting expedition where he actually decided to train with one of his friends, and that friend accidentally, without supervision, chopped off the head of of Charles the Bold's son. So I think at least there's some supervision by experienced and older individuals. I also think that those experienced older individuals had were actually the ones going out on raids and fighting, rather than what we think of now as how we think now at looking at military, like a lot of early 20s. Our guys in the early 20s going to war. I think in the early medieval period it would have been a lot more about the older experienced guys, maybe 30 to 40, that had some years under their belt that they would go out raiding. But yeah, as to why didn't Axis have thrusting tips? Not sure, but I think a lot of these axes, at least in the early medieval periods, still doubled as just functional tools. And if you have a thrusting tip on there, which they could certainly make, it became a very, very specialized weapon. And then it wouldn't necessarily have couldn't double as a tool anymore. If you really want something that's good at both chopping and stabbing or thrusting, you'd get a big winged spear. There's winged spears which have a diameter or a length of a blade of about 40 centimeters. You can easily chop with that. But as to why Axis didn't have thrusting tips, well, didn't need it. That's the shortest answer I can give. I see a question from Michael. Was a mace ever a royalty weapon? I'm not aware with a lot of maces in the early medieval period, so I can't really comment on that.
Well, something I'd also point out about why axes didn't have thrusting tips. It might also be a product of what they're doing to train for warfare. So, as Jasper was saying, the swords they're using seem to be quite big, choppy swords, big swung weapons. If they're not, obviously, it's actually quite rare that you get simulators like blunt steel simulators like we have today in historical martial arts training. Usually, people train with something cheaper. So sticks are really, really common. Like a stick is the most common training tool. And this is actually something you see throughout a lot of different cultures is people will train in stick fighting and then apply that stick fighting technique to a bladed weapon. And they might have some kind of sword specific training. Possible that no one thought to make an axe that was also capable of thrusting, or putting like a thrusting, or like making basically a thrusting axe, because they primarily weren't thrusting. It was a thing that they only occasionally did. They learned. They had these big choppy swords. They had big choppy sort of lynx axes, as machete type things. They had their axes, and they trained all of these by just getting a light flexible stick and basically playing stick fighting the way people have done in countless other cultures, and give two kids some sticks and they will practice fighting with them. So I think there's also potentially a cultural component where their martial arts just didn't involve that much thrusting unless it was with a spear, which handles really, really, really differently to a sword or an axe, as is.
I think that as far as the thrusting tip on the axe goes, good question. Part of it is because they didn't think of it. They did have axes with thrusting tips, and it was very, very useful. But why didn't they have baskets on their swords? Because they didn't think of it. All those developments came later. Some of them due to new ideas people came up with. Some of them due to the way the weapons were used. A lot was weapons as techniques changed. Mace, later period, bishops used maces because he who lives shall die by the sword. So if bishops got into battle, they didn't want to die by the sword, and as I said, they bashed your brains in with a lump of metal. But clubs are certainly not a royalty weapon. People have been beating each other over the head with heavy lumps for a long period of time. They're a very effective way, and people who couldn't afford a club, nothing wrong with a club. It's very effective. As far as shields overlapping, shield wall, this thing that they love doing, involving them standing with their shields overlapped, there is, as far as I know, zero actual evidence for it. The only two people, one, the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. We know that's what they did. It was depicted, it was described, the shields were specifically designed for it. That's how you define heavy infantry versus light infantry. Heavy infantry aren't chaps carrying heavy gear. Heavy infantry are chaps who fight shoulder to shoulder, one behind the other in a very close, dense formation that pushes the enemy over. And you don't have to wear heavy gear to do that. You just need a big shield like the Greeks had. Light infantry aren't wearing light gear. They're in more of a skirmishing order. So those designations depend on how they fight. And probably, as far as we know, most of the fighting would have been like the Greeks in the Viking period. It would have been more like skirmishing with more spaces in between the men. The Romans, we know, did both. The standard Roman formation was to have the men 6 feet, a man every 6 foot, every 1.8 meters. In other words, space for a man in between him. And then the next line of men behind him were shifted over one, so that if you tried to come between the two fellows in front of you, you'd walk straight into the guy behind them. If they needed to, the second rank would step forward and the butt against each other. But they used both formations. As far as that the Saxons use, that the Danes use, we don't know. The depictions we have on carvings aren't accurate enough. Descriptions from things like the sagas. Those sagas, they weren't there to tell us what happened. Somebody didn't have a story written about themselves for any other reason than to make them look good. That's why you told a story. So you weren't interested in what happened to everyone else in the battle. You wanted your audience to know what happened to you in the battle, because you're the one that counted. So those stories tell us what happened. So like any story, you got to take them with a grain of salt. Do you believe everything you read in paper nowadays? Not if you're sensible. So yeah, we don't know exactly how they use them, but it was more likely to be in a skirmish order with spaces between people. But sometimes you got packed close together. Sometimes the terrain pushed you together. But I can tell you what happens in a mass battle. If you get pushed too close together, you can't do anything with your weapons. So you don't want to be too packed close together. It's really in a formation of people who've been squashed together, because you can't even lift your arm up. And your enemy's going to just come up and chop you down. And that can, and what's been happening around you. And there's descriptions of battles that happen like that. So yeah, we don't know. The Viking shield wall, they called the shield up, they called their armor a net. They had all sorts of fancy of onomatopoeic names for their equipment. That didn't mean that's how they were used. So yeah, we have to kind of make it up, and that's the thing to remember. We can make shields like the ones we dig out of the ground. We can make swords like the ones that are in museums, and the armor we can say, but we don't know exactly how they use them. Not in battle. You know, the sword with a long cross hilt is going to be no good behind a shield. It gets in the way. You have a short cross hilt to keep it behind the shield. So the nature of the gear gives you a good idea. I've never been in a battle. You run at each other and start going bang, bang, bang with whatever. And whichever side does that better is the one. So we can speculate as much as we like about how they actually use them in battle. That we don't know. That's all speculation. So it's just with points on, yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
So I was going to try and
I did, in fact, once make myself a Dark Age in reenactment combat, but historically completely inaccurate. Not till later. I hope people could hear that, because it's been a little bit choppy at the moment.
Yeah, it's been a little bit.
Yeah, getting
This is
bunched up.
I was going to try all the axe themed questions.
Yeah, and you can use an axe as a. I mean, I wouldn't let it get smashed in the face with the front edge of an axe. That would be a nasty experience. And the top of the edge, that can be quite sharp. So it can. So no, wouldn't like to be hit in the face with the front edge of an axe. Would they have?
Be a bit like a pommel strike with fighting, where
Yes.
Yeah, you can.
We can learn how the weapons were used, and we come, of course, is we're never going to do it for real. And if you're never going to do it for real, you don't really know what it's. You don't, and there's no way around that. There's no way around that, because I don't want to be in a real battle, because from what I've heard, people die in them. Not much fun. Not much fun. Yeah. Well, got no evidence that they had lots of. We know in later periods when swords were cheap and common, yes, but you pretty much had a sword. You had a sword, and it was sharp. Yes, swords do cut, and there's a very good, which means, of course, that you don't shield with your sword, not on purpose. That's a dumb thing to do. That's how you get yourself into strife. Shield is, it doesn't have to be really heavy. If I'm fighting someone, I'm not going to hit their shield. I don't do them any harm hitting their shield. I want to hit a bit of them that I can see that's not behind a shield. The whole point about the shield is that I want to get round it. I don't want to try and go through it. We still on? The picture's bouncing around a bit.
I think you're still going. Yeah. Oh, it's the other thing to think about when
Jasper, what are your thoughts on that?
Sharps is
you still there, or has it?
Oh, I'm still. Is it a good idea? Oh, sorry, Jasper.
Just wanted to show this. I have one of my old shields that I first made, which I actually
a bit of freezing.
That's used. Everybody still there?
Yep, we're still here. We're just having some sound issues.
No, but
yeah. So yeah, just
just cut with a sharp. I actually cut in it about 40 times, and 40 times my sword got stuck.
And if you can trap someone's, it's a really good thing to do. Yep, and you can pull their sword out of their hand.
Yeah. So, but yes, you definitely do need to experience that. And even though a shield might look very thin and flimsy, it will still get stuck. Having such a thin shield might seem very unlogical at first, because you think thin is flimsy and it will break easily.
Well, fighting stupidly is very historical.
Yeah,
that's the thing about that.
But when you're in a fight, ideally don't cut that shield. Try to go around it. Not necessarily because it will block it, but you'll lose your sword, or you'll lose your axe, or whatever. So, and I think it's very likely that they did train with that, with sharps, and cutting into shields as well, because a shield is easily replaced. It will take only a day or two to make a new shield, or you can easily repair the planks that have been split by your sword. So they would have trained with that to know what it's like. And then try to avoid that situation when shit hits the fan and they were actually in a duel.
Yes, if they're someone with a very heavy shield, it's at a. Actually,
the other thing to keep in mind as well is that it's not necessarily about,
unless they're specific shields are intended, like Roman shields, which are very heavy shield, but that's used in a very different way. But yes, heavy shields. I don't like heavy shields. I hate them.
The shields that we do know, referring to
Just waiting for
this paper from the Society
Tim
of
disappeared.
is that these shields, Viking Age shields, early medieval shields, were only 4 kilos at max, and you don't want it any heavier than that, because as I said earlier, at least in my idea of early medieval warfare, and certainly in the earlier part of the Viking period, then there's a lot more skirmishing rather than pitched battles, and a lot of raiding. You want to be fast and agile. So I think there's some issues now in the background here. We're just trying to fix some things in the background here, so but yeah.
Okay, so I think are you hearing me now?
Yes,
Hear me?
I
Sweet.
hear you.
All right, excellent. Yeah, no, it was. I don't know what happened, but something bad. No, so the other point I was going to make is when people ask this question of better documented periods like the 19th century or like any time from the Enlightenment onwards, and even as early as sort of like the early, the Elizabethan period, and that it's always the thing is, we always go, oh, well, let's find accounts of what they were training with, and they're training with freaking everything like we do today. But what the question should
I don't know what the technical difficulties are.
The question should be, what did they think of it? Because in the 19th century, we know that people did train with sharps, but most of the reason we know that is because there's all these, fencing instruction stuff who are saying, please stop doing this. You either injure your training partners, which is bad,
I don't know if
or
anyone can hear me.
Oh, you are coming in, Pete.
I'm on air.
Yeah. But yeah, you either injure your training partners bad, or you learn to fight badly because you spend most of your time trying to not injure your training partners. And so, yeah, they probably did. You'd probably get people mucking around with sharps, especially given how informal the training was. And it might also be because of the shields, they did actually have drills that they do with sharps so that they could go, okay, this is what a sharp sword does to a shield. But they're probably also training not with sharps, not with sharps as well. They probably had a way of actually sparring so that they could actually test out and do stuff against a resisting opponent. So yeah, I guess the question's not.
That's a good question.
What were their thoughts?
I think.
Who's going to
I don't know for sure. What happened was that the tactics did change over time. Everybody changed their tactics as they met each other. The more fighting do, people are very, very quick to learn. Fighting, not at all. In terms of actual fighting with weapons, I've been fighting since now. So I've had a lot of it with spears and axes, swords in group combat, rather artificial combat techniques, lots of safety rules. But all in all, I'm using weapons now for some in the region of 40 years. So I've handled a lot of different weapons. Would that be any good in a? I've got no idea whatsoever. Probably better than no experience at all.
That's fair enough. Just answer the question on screen right now. I have roughly about 5.5 years of HEMA experience, now re-enactment experience, and at the moment it's mainly academia that I'm focused on because of lockdown. But about the earlier question or later question asked, if the Vikings improved their fighting skills and tactics, yes, they did. As Peter pointed out, people always improve on what they do and what they know. It's just the nature of things, and you can also see that in that some of the Frankish swords were, of course, imported in Scandinavia and adopted, and those swords and the ideas coming with them on, say, hilt design change the parameters on how they're used. The contact did, of course, help with the Vikings adapting their fighting styles. But it's also more of a political question, I think.
I'm not sure if Jasper is frozen from other people's ends, but he is here. So I'm just going to start talking and hope that it doesn't disrupt the stream too much. Yeah, so in terms of my own experience, just in terms of my own experience as well fighting, this is kind of why I put this question up, is most of what I've done is obviously the simulators. Never been in more than like a scuffle. I did have someone swing a blunt sword at my head once, non-consensually, and as a result put them in a rear-naked choke, but that's another story. But yeah, like basically everything I've done is sort of pressure tested against a resisting opponent with simulators.
Perhaps we were in the first place.
I don't know about you guys, but they've cut out for me again. But
I can't. Jasper is frozen.
Well,
Okay, that's better than they with the sharp axe.
Yeah. But yeah, on weapon improvements in Scandinavia, I think it also corresponds with the political situation in Scandinavia as time progresses. Our idea of states started to emerge with established royal households, for instance, and established governments. Whilst early in the Viking periods, earlier than that, in the early days of the early medieval period in the Netherlands, political power was focused on strong individuals, and as soon as
he's got the show to himself.
As soon as
sounds.
Okay. Oh. Yeah. So I don't know what's going on. Although, if people can let me know if I'm back in the comments, I think from the looks of things, Jasper can hear me. But yeah, if you can hear me in the comments. Okay, just my audio cut out sometime.
Very annoying.
Anyway, yeah.
How many drinks? I'll be picking up a minute or two.
I guess this is the problem of trying to connect between the Netherlands and Australia. I can see Tim again.
Yes, no.
This was a very messy, very messy section, but I think that weapon improvement has something to do with political stabilization of as soon as an area became more stable, that other improvements started to become available, like advances in sword use. Because when a political structure is stabilized, then there's no need to show off anymore, as was the case with the early medieval heavy chopping swords. And you can
Yeah, so do I.
become more efficient.
NBA.
And we're back in contact with Australia, I see.
We're back. I think there's no shortage of comments basically complaining about the Australian internet, which between that and spiders is probably the two most experiences.
I can see Tim and I can see Jasper, but
assuming people can hear me, my other very Australian experience was there was actually a spider in my shield tonight. To grab this spider webs, and there's an actual spider in there as well. And we both realised our various life mistakes at that moment. Cool. So, assuming that Jasper is laughing at me, I'm assuming that means that I'm back and communicating internationally.
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly fine. I can see you perfectly fine.
Cool. I don't know how much of my answer to the question on screen you got, but I did actually, when someone asked, I did actually want to put that to everyone, because I think it's really, really important that we say where our experiences are coming from. And I think it's because you get a lot of people have a lot of, there was a serial problem with reenactment for a very long time where people were trusting the opinion of professional historians who were very good historians, certainly, and maybe very good archaeologists as well, possibly both. But near as I can tell, were not very good fighters. I think
spiders in a line, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. What tended to happen was that you have people trying to get things to work that they've read in history books that were based off guesses people made without much fine experience. So in terms of my personal experience, with specifically Viking stuff, is I've gotten blunt simulators, things that are designed to handle like the actual but not actually hurt the other person, and also protective gear like fencing masks, padded jackets, things that allow me to fight with a full range of targets, and then basically gone, right, well, let's spar, let's actually spar with these. Let's train an unarmed martial art like boxing.
So what's that like? Tell us about that.
And let's take that methodology and apply it to weapons where we get the closest simulator we can without actually hurting each other, and try and find ways to fight that let us do the biggest range of techniques possible against someone who is trying to stop us from doing those techniques successfully and do their own techniques successfully against us. And I've done that with various weapons for a number of years, including Viking Viking Age weapons, including spear and shield, sword and shield, a little bit of axe and shield, but not that much, and also things like single sword and knife. Basically, I've done the thing that all good unarmed martial artists do, where they test their ideas out against a resisting opponent with as much speed and power as can be done without actually hurting their training partners. Cool. So, hoping you can still hear me. Cool. So, yeah, let's. We'll keep. All right, Jasper's back. All right. Sorry if this seems really scattered, but we're also having trouble with our own audio where we can't necessarily hear each other.
That's definitely
talking.
Right control and highly cooperative people.
So
my almost invariably just use horses for getting around.
And he's gone. No, did Vikings use cavalry units in the beginning? Depends on your view. Yes, they were. I'm sorry, I was muting myself. The Vikings did have a tendency to be very mobile with their long ships, but also in really need of some cavalry, or at least horses to get around. Mobility was really key for them. In terms of fighting on horseback, there's not a lot of evidence for that. Because there weren't really specialized war horses as there were in the later medieval period. Also, weaponry doesn't seem to be specialized in that regard as well. What's more likely for Vikings in early medieval period is that you'd go around on a battlefield on horse, but as soon as the fighting would happen, if you intended to stay in that fight, you'd dismount and fight on foot. But if you wanted to quickly get away, you'd try something on horseback. But like 99 or 90% of all cavalry or engagements in which cavalry was involved, they were actually fighting on foot. So yeah, that's they mainly just use horses to get around, and I think that's the same idea as well for the Franks, at least in the early part of the Viking Age, where they just ride around and be mobile instead of fight on foot.
Well, there's actually an economic component to cavalry and the rise of cavalry units, where in the Viking Age, a horse was really, really expensive. And like getting one horse for particular horse for personal use was really, really expensive. There was a thing in one of the sagas that talks about a king giving one of his favorite warriors a gift of 2 fighting horses, and this was an amazing gift because you're getting 2 horses. What that means is a horse is a very, very valuable thing, and if it's lost in battle, you've lost, you've not only lost a huge investment, more so than any other war gear, but you've also lost something that you were relying on for transport. And so the point where cavalry really becomes viable is a point where the economies of various European nations have built up to the point where they could afford to have, not just a horse for war, but also backup horses. I think a knight, like a Norman knight, would have 3 separate horses. So if they lost one in battle, they had a backup horse, and if they lost that horse in the battle, well, they still had another horse that could help cart them and their stuff around. And so yeah, you don't tend to see horses in Viking Age warfare enough because the economy is just not large enough. There's just not enough wealth in the world or in Europe at that point. And I think it's also no coincidence that the Frankish Empire, which is one of the largest and wealthiest in Europe at the time, is the first to really get into cavalry in a big way because they're also the ones who can afford it. They have the money. The exception to that is the Mongols, because the Mongols are the exception. Like if you're a nomadic people who have lots of horses because that's your lifestyle, then yeah, you have a lot of cavalry. But if you're a settled pastoral people, horses tend to be very, very expensive, and you don't, and so you don't want to risk one in warfare because if you lose it, there's the logistics of it and the expense of it just makes it untenable. And that's I think also why we don't see horses until the end of the Viking Age and the beginning of the Middle Ages, when economies are larger.
Well, to be fair, the Vikings on their raids didn't buy horses; they stole other people's horses, used them to gallop around on. But they didn't fight on horseback because that's not how they fought. They didn't fight as cavalry. You fighting as cavalry is a different thing, and requires a lot of training. But because horses are expensive to train to fight with cavalry, really only wealthy states can afford to do that, or on the converse, an entire people who live on horses all their lives. So, for example, the nomads, who just, that's all they had, horses. They lived on horses, they died on horses, they presumably mated on horses and gave birth on too.
Very good points. Though, I think in that case we've answered this question. But Tim, you said something that I'd like to, get into a bit deeper. Also, with discussing here is you said the gifts of horses, which made the question pop up in my mind. The practice of gift giving and how people obtain swords in the early medieval society, and also Vikings. How do people get their sword? We just buy them from a blacksmith. But I don't think for such a prestigious object as a sword that necessarily buy it from a blacksmith or you buy it from a market. There's quite some evidence also from, for instance, the Beowulf poem, where they talk in huge lengths about the splendor of the weapons and armor brought forward by Beowulf and his warriors. You really had to earn your weapons. You really had to earn your armor from your local king or warlord, who then give that object, who then give an object, possibly as a spoil of war or whatever, or because the king purchased it, he then gave it to you. And so you really had to also really show off to your warlord that you were worth that weapon or that object. So I don't know if any of you have some thoughts about that. Of course, with a very personalized grip assembly, as soon as you get a sword or a sword blade, you take it to your local blacksmith. But initially, how you obtain that would be earning it, showing off to your warlord or to your king that you're worth it. And I also think that's initially how, for instance, Charlemagne chose his earls and his counts based on how his subjects showed themselves off during the many wars the Franks fought. You pick the few that are sticking out the most as your new leaders. You make them part of your entourage, and they get to earn their swords. Do you understand a bit what I'm going with here?
Yeah, and
they were rare and very, very expensive items. Axe in battle. Why? Because an axe uses a small amount of. You can use one that you've already got at home, or modify it, because axe is used in war and not the same axe is used to chop wood on the whole. But yes, or a spear. Make a spear. Your village blacksmith can make you a spear. You can't make you a sword. Armor as well. In say 500 AD, 600 AD, who had helmets? We have richly decorated ones, which had them. Everyone else had the clothes they stood up in, a shield, and a dagger. Hopefully, that was what most people had. Something else, you'd have to, as you say, prove yourself to your lord, or and loot it off somebody.
Well, it does raise a kind of interesting question, as well as if swords are an important gift item. And I'm pretty sure there's references in the sagas to like swords as heirlooms and giving swords to family members. Would that then suggest that there maybe that their frequency in the archaeological record is maybe actually less than it was in the period, because people wouldn't people would be buried with their swords. They'd pass their swords on, and they'd be buried maybe with their other weapons. Does that potentially, like the fact that swords are valuable enough that they're a very, very powerful gift, mean that someone is, when someone sort of choosing what grave goods, their father or mother or whoever is being buried with, they go, all right, well, actually, the sword needs to stay in the family. That needs to be passed on as an heirloom, and like the spears and the axes can go in the grave.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
I think
it is commonly accepted that what we think as archaeologists in the ground is only a small percentage of what was actually around at some point. And yeah, swords in their usable, the time in which they can be used can span generations, maybe a few centuries, whilst they're still being around and used. Though at some point, of course, they get discontinued. They get thrown in a river or deposited in a grave. And the reason why is not really known. At least there's too many swords in rivers to just think of them as being lost during either a battle or when crossing the river. There's just too many of them. There would be a lot of flimsy individuals to drop their swords, their most prestigious gift, to just drop it in a river. So so in that sense, not only because of their rarity, but every sword or weapon found has been lost, presumably been lost with a meaning. Maybe that person fell into disgrace with his lord, or his line got discontinued because there wasn't any kid to follow him up, or to follow the person up with owning the sword. So yeah, there's always a reason why they end up in the ground. And simply being lost is really applicable to the large sum of them that's being found. And also, swords can be recycled, helmets can be recycled, shield bosses and spears, they can be recycled. Just send them to the blacksmith and he'll make a new thing out of it.
And the one thing perhaps much a burial is a public display, who happens to be an odd man in your community, and you bury him with a cheap one, that is going to affect your reputation in your community, I think, because we don't know how they thought about those sorts of things.
Yeah, no,
it's an entirely useful thing. Burial was display, and displaying your wealth and generosity were, as far as if you generously gave stuff away, people thought highly and hung on to your stuff. People thought less of you.
No, that's certainly true.
And that's something.
Oh, yeah, no, that's something that's indeed present across like most of the cultures known throughout history. Gift giving is very valued. But in that sense, something that I try to look at as well is, you can make a really ornate sword to then bury with your beloved father or grandfather. But then just trying to cheap out of it by making it actually a non-functional sword or having it too highly decorated. That's something that at least never happened. So at least all the weapons that we do have are battle ready.
Real swords. Right.
Yeah, they're swords. So in that sense, there's also the idea, something that I've also read in the dissertation of Sue Brenning, who's now the conservator at the British Museum, that at least every sword that is found has at least seen action at some point in its life. So yeah, that's there are actually functional swords that are being deposited. Nobody tried to cheapskate.
There was no tokenism.
Nope.
That's really interesting. If you're in the account of Ibn Fadlan of the Varangian Rus, which we don't, there's a lot of suggestion that they're probably not as Scandinavian as was previously thought. But one of the things that Ibn Fadlan notes is that a lot of the grave goods that were being made for the burial of this king, whose burial he witnessed, were actually were made for the king during the preparations for burial. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that a lot of the Viking swords that we've found in graves have marks of use and have that seem to be practically used things. One thing actually is probably also relevant to this is there's a suggestion that the Vikings placed a lot of importance on the idea of luck and of the symbolics of an object. And it's even suggested that they wouldn't necessarily have been as enthusiastic about looting battlefields as later medieval Europeans. There's a Jackson Crawford video about this, because it was thought that maybe, like, if someone died in battle, their weapon was unlucky. Whereas conversely, if someone maybe was a very successful warrior through the course of their life, and they have a sword that serves them well, that sort of had value over and above irregular swords. So there might have even been a notion of, okay, well, some swords are particularly important to pass on. Other swords are maybe it's better just to bury the person with their sword. So there's, I guess I'm doing something I seem to do a lot of tonight is complicating things even more by saying, actually, there's even more possibilities. But yeah, I think that's also.
Well, we still do that today, don't we? Everybody has a lucky thing, and especially soldiers, vicious people. You have zero control of bullets flying around and shells landing on your head. So it's easy to become superstitious in that situation. And if a soldier has a weapon that seems to them to serve them well, they won't give it up.
Mm.
They'll hang on to it.
Mm.
My lucky sword, or
I kind of also wonder if there's a notion of what the person's going to need in the afterlife. We actually know a lot less about pre-Christian ideas of the afterlife than I think is popularly supposed, just based on the cyber evidence we have. But there might also be a prospect that someone's going, well, if they're going to Valhalla and they're going to be fighting at Ragnarok, they're going to need this sword. Whereas if someone died, maybe of disease or of old age, and they're going to experience a different afterlife, then maybe the theory is, well, okay, they might not need their weapons as much. They might need other objects, or they might need, maybe they're more likely going to need sentimental objects. Which I think sort of complicates things a bit further. So yeah, I guess the moral of the story is culture. A lot of this would be culturally determined, and we just don't know enough about their culture.
Okay, so yes, axe and shield. Yeah, in a ding dong battle, probably do a lot more damage with an axe than you can with a sword. But don't forget that the shield in Dark Age combat, as far as we knew, weapons. You'll have a shield, but yes, an axe. Yep. If I was actually going into a real fight, there's a chance I might die, and I think I'm gonna have to kill people to survive. An mace would be a good thing. Do a lot of damage with an axe or a mace. With an axe or a mace, you've only got to hit someone once, and they're probably not going to be anymore.
We've also got a good question from Vlad at the moment as well. How the Franks and Saxons adapted to the Vikings. In terms of tactics, both Franks and Saxons did something different. For me, I personally know a little bit more about what the Franks did, but we mainly know that through history. Though we also have some archaeological evidence for that. Is at least here in the Netherlands, a lot more ringed fortresses and ringed walls start to appear, so they fortify themselves a bit. Also, in terms of politics, the Franks are famous for using Norse or Danish warlords, and certainly exiled elites of Danish societies to give them land along the coast, which is frequently raided. So that's also how the Netherlands and certainly the Frisian parts got Frisian overlords at some point, but most famously, of course, is Normandy with Rollo, and then continuing all the way to William the Conqueror, actually putting in place Danish dynasties to help fend off the land from their countrymen. In terms of the Saxons, yeah, I'm not too familiar with that, of course, because it's not, I only know what is already circulating on the internet in that part. But yeah, the Franks certainly did try to adapt in a way, though their military system, at least in the beginning of the Viking raids, was very rudimentary, because Franks would, as we know from history, gather once a year all the free men to go to war, and that's not a very responsive system when dealing with a lot of small Viking raids. So they did try to come up with a system, but they were hampered very much by their political situation, with a lot of infighting. Certainly at the fall, after Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, you got the Carolingian Empire being split into three, with the Western, Eastern, and Lotharingian kingdoms in place. And those three just kept fighting each other under the table until only France and Germany remained, and the Lotharingian kingdom was split up between the two of them. And those Danish warlords that were put in place were almost more actively being used to fight the other kingdoms than to fight the Vikings. Funnily enough, but I don't know if, at least for the Saxons, I know they also put a lot more circular ramparts, fortresses around, so that people had a place to hide, and resistance could be mounted against Viking raids. And that's about it. I don't know if the question about that.
I mean, Anglo-Saxons, at least under Alfred the Great, reorganized a lot of their military, and they kind of, that Germanic custom that the Franks had of get everyone together at one point during the year and go to war, and they basically reorganized and created the feared militia system, where you could get people, you could get people together and mobilize much quicker. So if you heard about a raid, you got word that a raid was coming, or that a Danish army was coming in from the north, you could get together this militia, you could mobilize your troops and mobilize your militia much faster, and mobilize. And so yeah, they changed, in fact, quite a bit of their social structure. I mean, Alfred the Great was quite notorious for basically reorganizing all of the lands that he had dominion over, so that they could organize and respond much faster to the Viking raids.
Don't forget the Navy.
Oh no! Tell us about the Navy.
Because the problem you've with second raid, they can land anywhere, and you put your boys somewhere, they go somewhere else. And Alfred was the first one who worked out, hey, we actually have to meet them on the sea and kill them in the sea before they get to the land. And while they had centralized control to do that, it worked. And Charlemagne's kingdom splits into three. All of that goes by the board, and the Vikings have a free hand. Vikings changed over the years as well, didn't they? They got better, and got bigger and bigger as the centuries went by. So, and they worked out, hey, let's go over there with an army of 10,000 men and stay there. Which is why they became nuisance as time went by.
So I do hope that answered your question a bit. Also see a question about the domed shields. I don't know. I have no experience with dome shields. So I'm not going to comment on that. Maybe others have some experience with dome shields. But...
No, never used this one either.
No, yeah.
But I've got a Rotella shield, and they're really good at shedding those. Yes, I agree with Deandra. Great to try.
One day, when we have all the resources to recreate all of these things. I mean, I guess the one comment I would make about a duel is if you've got the same weapons as your opponent, most weapons are worth using for a duel. Because you're never going to be at a disadvantage if your opponent has the same weapons as you. But yeah, I guess that comes down to the dueling customs as well.
No, I'd be really interested in trying, of course, but for that I want to make one based on an archaeological example. But so far as I know, there are no surviving domed shields.
Any?
No, exactly. So that makes it very difficult. We only have artwork to rely upon, but the artwork from this time period is not very reliable.
No.
So I'm not.
Quite a few people have made an attempt, but we don't know how close they are to the original. So keep digging, Jasper. Keep digging.
I'm certainly trying. In that sense, we technically have perfect conditions for the preservation of such shields or any wooden object in that sense because it's very wet.
That's your job.
I mean, yeah, no, that's my job. I'll keep looking. I keep excavating else and whatever waterlogged closed context I can come across. So I'm certainly trying, but thus far I've only had.
You're a young fellow. We're relying on you.
Well, thank you. That's hard working. No, but yeah, if somebody at some point could come across an archaeological article detailing or mentioning that a shield was found which happens to be domed or possibly domed, I'd be happy to know, and I can try my hand and reconstruct.
You'll be there like a shot. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So we've been going for 2.5 hours.
Me too. So I think we might finish up here, but thank you both for coming and joining in, talking about Viking Age weapons for 2.5 hours, which is quite epic. So just so people know, there's going to be something happening with the Old Sword Club every Wednesday at this time, or 2.5 hours before this time starts. Whether it's going to be a regular saber lesson or a talk or a special weapon, there will be something on. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, keep an eye on our website. Updates will be plentiful. The other thing I'm going to bring up is that we do have some overheads with running these. It's not much, and we've mostly been able to cover it. But still, it would be nice just, if you did want to support the club and, help us keep going, feel free to make a donation. There's a link in the video description to this and also in the chat. Hopefully I'll see more. I'll see everyone who came down the track, and also thank you again to Jasper and Pete for coming and speaking.
Jasper, thank you very much. I love your work. Keep doing that. That shield stuff is really nice. I want to see more of that.
Yeah,
and just anything I see you that I like, feel it, teach it to my students. Okay.
Please do. Please try to apply it yourself. I'm very happy if more people try to experiment with sword and shield. Spread the sword. That's
small, and people just keep going, hey, what about this? What about this? and trying it. And the more people doing it, the more we learn. I want where, everyone can beat me in combat, because that means everyone. That's the ideal. Teachers want to see their students beat them, basically. Anyway, good night, folks, and really nice meeting you, Jasper. And and keep digging.
Yeah,
keep digging. Don't stop digging.
Next week, so I'm going out there again. So it's work.
Excellent. All right. I'll see you guys later.
Yes.
Good night, all.
Bye.
Thanks to the audience as well. Thanks for the good questions.
Yeah, no, really good questions, guys. Thank you.
Mick Parker, you're going to have to give us an idea of what it's like in a shield wall when you're dealing with a bunch of riotous people. That would be useful experience.
Night.